by filling your mind with Torah in a creative way, your mind is released from an interest in the superficial satisfaction.
Shalom Aleichem, and welcome to Shtark Tank, the podcast about the challenges and opportunities of being a Ben Torah in the workforce. This week, we have a real and raw conversation about Kedusha in today's exposed world. This is something that all B'nai Torah deal with, but those in the workforce have an even tougher challenge. While I am completely unqualified to have a real opinion on this subject, I do have a theory. The results of a war, a football game, or business competition boils down to two things: strength and strategy. It seems to me that today the Yetzer Hara has tremendous strength, and while we should certainly be working to build up our own strength, my humble theory is that the focus should be on strategy. When you don't have the firepower, you need to be able to outmaneuver the other side. But then the question becomes, what strategies can we use? Do we have a choice whether or not to work? Can we control how our coworkers dress and behave? I am not suggesting that we have no flexibility in these areas, but for many people, these are severe limitations. So I sat down with Rabbi David Lapin. Rabbi Lapin has been on this podcast a number of times before. He's a Rav, Talmid Chacham, Marbitz Torah, and an acclaimed international business consultant. And I think he validated my theory: strategy over strength. This is not a conversation about yichud, handshakes, and going out to corporate events. Those are all important topics, but we need to dig deeper. This is an attempt to reframe the conversation about Shemiras HaEinayim, to focus on areas that are in our control and where we can affect real change. I found Rav Lapin's ideas nuanced, practical, and refreshing, and I hope you will too. So today we're going to talk about a subject that almost everyone struggles with and basically nobody talks about, but it's a very important topic. It's the topic of Shemiras HaEinayim, and I can't think of someone who's better suited to help us explore and unpack some of these issues than Rabbi David Lapin, who's been a featured guest on the podcast many times, but it's very exciting to have you back. So first of all, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Yaakov. Thanks. Great to be with you.
So let's just start maybe from Bereshis, the story of Adam being created. One of the most fundamental facts of our humanity is the fact that there's man and there's woman, and there's a beautiful and important union between those two. But along with that beauty also comes challenges and struggles and Yetzer Hara and Gilui Arayos and all these things. So where do we see the Torah's fundamental hashkafa being expressed in these stories, and where should we sort of start approaching this topic?
So firstly, congratulations on raising the topic, because this isn't something that people often talk about, and it's so necessary to talk about. It's the kind of thing, I suppose, in the older days we wouldn't have talked about befaresia. We would have done it in private conversations, but there are so many B'nai Torah who are dealing with this, and I think you're right and courageous to use your platform as a way of helping people through this difficult maze. And I don't know that we have answers for every situation for everybody, but let's explore some of the approaches to it. And you're starting off with this male-female dynamic, which is so important. And what's important about it is that there needs to be an energy between the male and female forces in the world. It's not just between man and woman. We know in the Kabbalah, the Dufra and the Nukva are two forces of reality that apply in every area. Everything has a male and a female drive to it, and it's the interface and the interaction and the tension between those two drives that creates so much in so many different areas. Even Lashon HaKodesh, that has a masculine and a feminine form for every word, for every noun, for every verb, every adjective. We live in a world of gender identification, of separation of gender, that come together and move apart, and comes together and move apart. Even the halachas of Taras HaMishpacha is one of a tide and an ebb, of a moving apart and coming together. It's that coming together in which the energy is. But to come together, there needs to be separateness. This is something that the general world, the secular world, has lost sight of. You can't come together and then stay together forever, and now you're together. It's the act of coming together. That's what attraction is. That's what femininity is. That's what the male-female force is the coming together. And to come together, there has to be a separateness first. And the maintenance of that separateness is as important a part of understanding these areas as the quality of coming together. And important in the coming together and the staying apart, we'll talk about some of the techniques of halacha and the staying apart, and particularly in the world in which we live. But the coming together is also important. A wonderful friend of mine who's no longer alive, Rabbi Bernard, was a Rav in Johannesburg and gave a very well-known series of talks to Chassan and Kalas, which he used to do in private, and also he gave many speeches about it. And his approach was talking to women, in fact, in this situation is, your husband is going out to work. The fact is he is going to meet women out at work. The fact is the woman he meets when he gets to the office is somebody who spent an hour putting herself together, making herself look gorgeous, and is there at his beck and call. He walks in and she's offering him tea or coffee and sorting him out, and she's there to serve him. And then he goes home after that. And what you want to prevent is that he doesn't leave home and his wife looks like a mess because she's just got up and she's had children to take care of and things are difficult. And then he gets to work and there's these gorgeous women around him. And then he comes home and the wife is tired and exhausted. She's been working or she's been with the kids. And she's once again, and there's no romance in the marriage. The romance is then outside of the marriage. Then you've got the imagination, because this whole area of halacha is about koach hadimyon. It's all about the male imagination and how that operates. So to come from a situation which is dull routine at home into a situation which is vibrant and challenging and interesting and supportive at work, that's the danger. More than if it just, it's not so much about the technical halachot, do you, although they're important as well, of course, do you shake a woman's hand, don't you? Questions of yichud, these are all important questions. But there's a bigger question, and that is just the nature of the contrast between life at home and life in the workplace. And you can't do anything about life in the workplace. You're not going to make that dull. You're not going to make that free of women. And so the man finds himself in this situation. How does he reinforce himself from within? Because I really believe, and perhaps my approach is a little bit different here to many others, that there's very little we can do about the environment. There's not even that much we can do. There's some things we can do, but not a lot about how we engage with the environment. But the really important thing is, how reinforced am I from within? To what extent is my mind and my heart and my imagination occupied with other things, including my relationship with my wife and family? But not only that, so that there is less space. There is less of a vacuum for this enormous, just this flow of imagery, sexual imagery, and just the nuances that are thrown at us all the time. There needs to be less space within me for that to take root.
So I love that framing, and we're going to dive into it a little deeper in a moment. But before we get to there, I just want to take a little bit of a historical perspective. So we started off by saying that within the fabric of creation, there's this balance and tension and beautiful potential and also danger. And, in around the 1960s up until today, advancements in birth control and women's rights and have created what some have referred to as the sexual revolution, where we live in a time where it's completely normal to have ladies walking down the street wearing basically nothing and massive billboards of women wearing basically nothing. So as a Ben Torah, how do we think about this? Like, what does Hashem want from us living in such a generation?
So Yaakov, I think to myself, again, maybe this is a bit controversial. I say, Baruch Hashem that we have all this, because it gives us an excuse. When we get to Shemayim, we can say, Ribono Shel Olam, really, if you would have put Moshe Rabbeinu in this environment, who knows whether we would have had a Moshe Rabbeinu. It's so difficult. When I went to visit Lithuania, I realized one of the powers of that environment, even now, going now, where there's no Torah there, they're just going there, but just the natural environment, it's quiet, little villages where you see where these Gedolei Israel lived. And yes, some lived in Kovna and in Vilna, and these were big cities at the time, but nothing like our cities. But most of the Torah, so much of the Torah, were from these little villages, just tranquil and peaceful and beautiful. And one wonders how much Torah there would have been. And it's incredible when you think of it, that in our world of today, there is so much Torah in places like New York and Lakewood and Monsey and Chicago, places like Tel Aviv and Yerushalayim. It's incredible that there's so much Torah when you think of how much distraction there is. And yes, there are complaints and justified that there's a lot of Gashmias that's crept into the Torah life in these areas. But okay, look at the wonders of what is happening, the Torah that's being learned, that's coming out, the Mesiras Nefesh for Torah. I kind of think to myself, when I'm in a certain mood, that the Rebbe Hashem is looking at this and saying, you guys are amazing. I couldn't have put any other generation into this kind of nisoyon and have you do at least what you're doing. So I think we need to take some pride, not to beat ourselves up too much about it. Oh, yeah, this is terrible and I'm not managing and I'm not coping and I'm such a bad person. It's so easy to get into that spin. But to be able to look and say, despite all of this, I'm trying, I'm raising myself. I go into davening and I clear my mind before I go into davening. And yes, My mind isn't clear all the time because stuff is thrown at me constantly. But I do my best, and I'm able to learn Torah, and I'm able to think and do chesed and stock, all these wonderful things, even though the environment is such a hard one in which to operate. So I think it's created a lot of inner friction in us, both as communities and as individuals. And overcoming the friction, we had that at the end of Zebor and Daf Yomi the other day with the Rashi on Mar Ukva, that his overcoming of his Yetzer Hara and not taking advantage of a woman who he was madly in love with, but was a married woman, and his not taking advantage of her in a situation where it would have been so easy for him to do it, that gave him an aura. That's why he was called Tzutzita, the man who has this aura of light coming from it. The energy of resisting this Yetzer Hara is so powerful that it actually created a physical aura of light. So I think we're living with that resistance. We're living in a spiritual gym. We're lifting weights every day. And yes, do we sometimes drop the weight? Do we sometimes fail as we're trying to lift this weight? We do, but we're working at it day after day after day, and we're getting stronger and stronger. So I think we need to take pride in that also, not only beat ourselves over the head and work on how can we strengthen ourselves even more within ourselves. You've just got to say that Rebbe Moshe, for whatever reason, wants this generation to overcome these nisyonos, not to be protected from them.
Right. When we do have the precedent in Parak Chelek, where a theoretical conversation between Menashe and the Moraim, where the Menashe tells them, if you would have been in my generation, you would have lifted up your coattails and run to do Avodah Zarah. So it certainly resonates with the current reality. But you were sort of zoning in on another point, which is the fact that we have both a tremendous amount of Torah and also a tremendous struggle in these areas. And for a lot of individuals, that can certainly feel lead to cognitive dissonance. And then you sort of the guilt, which you pointed out, can sort of, the Yetzer Hara can take that dynamic and say, well, you're obviously a faker, because if you're doing this on your phone at nights, then the state of it learning in the morning is obviously not worth anything. And it's worse because you're not even being straight with yourself. You're a Russia in Tzadik's clothing. So can you maybe give us a little more onto how to approach that dynamic, which I think is something that everyone experiences in some way, shape, or form?
Yeah, great. There's the Medrash in Eicha where the Rebbe Shalom says, "Alavayo si azvu ves Torah si shomaru." If only they would have left me and kept the Torah, because ha'or shebo machzirim lemut, of the power of Torah brings one back. So Torah acknowledges the fact that we're not in a static space of accomplishment, of refine, and we're in a place of Kedusha. Of course, we've had our Kedoshim, we have our Tzaddikim who are in that situation, and that's what makes them who they are. But the ordinary person isn't in that situation, and we have our ups and downs, we have our ebbs and flows. The same as I mentioned with the tension between male and female, there's the tension between Kedusha and Tumah, and we oscillate. We're not permanently in one space. I wish we were, but for some reason that's not where the Rebbe wants us to be. But what I think is important is something that the Vilna Gaon says. It's in Maaseh Rav, where he criticized, and I don't remember if it's Chaim Volozhin talking about what the Vilna Gaon said, or so in his own words, but he talks about the fact, he's talking about Balei Keri and how guilty people feel about being Balei Keri, and that the Balei Musa say that there's no, talk about the Balei Musa at that time, that the takona for Keri is miso, that death is the takona, there's no kapora for Keri except miso. So if a man has allowed his thoughts to go to such a point where it actually affected him from a perspective of Tahara and sexuality, then what a terrible thing it is. And the Vilna Gaon writes there, yes, that is so, but Torah has the power of the kapora of Misa. And it's an enormous cleansing power and the power of Torah. And I think that's not only as a takona, I've done something wrong, now I learn, so it's like going to the mikveh. There is that immersing oneself in learning. The only things we can immerse ourselves in is a mikveh. We can immerse ourselves in sukkah, is one of the mitzvahs that covers us, and Torah is an immersive mitzvah. We can take our minds, our bodies, our everything, and immerse it in Torah and have it cleansed. But it's more than that. I think the Vilna Gaon is also alluding to the fact that by filling your mind with Torah in a creative way, and we'll talk about that in a moment, because that's important, in a creative way, your mind is released from an interest in the superficial satisfaction of these images and chas v'shalom pornography and everything that goes with that. The danger is when one's mind is not creative, when one's neshama is, when you're not feeling creatively fulfilled. So when the Vilna Gaon says, so learn a lot of Torah, engaged in Torah. I think what he's saying is be mechadish in Torah, get engaged in Torah in a way that is really creative, so that you're fulfilled. A person who's fulfilled, who's satisfied, who's dynamic, who's growing, who's excited and exciting, has less need and less desire for these things. It doesn't mean that he's free from them. Everybody has the challenge, but it's much easier to deal with. And that's what I'm talking about, that inner reinforcement. Our style of learning we should be looking at. How are we learning? How are we teaching? Are we getting engaged at the deep level? That we've spoken before about the Daf Yomi movement, and that creates a social environment which is very powerful, that there's a whole chabur of people around the world who are learning with one. That's important. Creating chavrusa and relationships and friendships within that, that's important. But really having time also to learn deeply and to be mechadish in one's learning in a way that inspires one, uplifts one, and takes one right out of this atmosphere in which we're living, to the point where the things that people are occupied with on the street just don't interest us. Not because they're terrible, but because we're just in a different space. It's just not something we're engaged in. I like to think that that's where the opportunity is more than trying to escape the environment and close your eyes. And to me, that breeds guilt. And the more that you breed guilt with it, the more susceptible one comes to it, one is to it.
Yeah, and I really like that. And I think just to put a pin on one of the things that you said, which I think is super important, is that this is not a strategy to destroy any temptation or to become completely clean and to avoid any struggle. It's a strategy to minimize and mitigate it, along with other things that are going to need to be done and failures that might inevitably come. And coming away from this like thought of perfection and never having to struggle or never having to fall and have to dust yourself off afterwards. Just want to make sure that's clear, because I think that's a very important point that maybe is a whole nother topic, maybe a whole nother conversation about perfectionism and Avodas Hashem that I did want to just point out. Do you want to say anything else about that, or I'll maybe follow up with another question?
No, that's great. I think then the one point which also maybe touched on too briefly is, I think this is something for husbands and wives to talk about together. And there's a really important role for the couple to create sexual energy between them, to create attractiveness, to create interest between them. It needs work. It's something sometimes that works well in the dating period and then the first parts of the marriage, and then it kind of falls into disuse. And that's the danger. That it really needs work. The couple needs to work on having romantic times, on her being attractive, on her understanding what the male imagination is and what she's competing with, not in the terms that it's competition, but he's going out and that's what he's seeing, and those are comparisons his subconscious mind is making, even if his conscious mind isn't doing that at all. And to make sure that she's engaged with him in a way that is attractive and that is feminine and that is building of his ego, and because men need that. And that's part of the problem. You talked about the sexual revolution. Part of it is that women have redefined their role in many cases, and it's taken that energy out of it, that the part of the woman's role is to bolster the masculinity of the man. It's pathetic that we men need it, but we do. That's the way we are. That's the nature of the male ego. It needs bolstering, and women are brilliant at bolstering it. But if they're just becoming kind of carbon copies of men in women's clothes, then that's not going to happen. That energy isn't going to be there. So I think couples need to talk about this and make conscious attempts to preserve the romance in their marriage for their entire lives. In their old age, it doesn't make any difference. For each age, there's a form of romance that works, and to be committed to that is terribly important.
Beautiful. So let's transition to some practical things that we can be doing. You alluded to before that your approach is really focused on the internal world that each and every one of us has to build. And it leads me to a thought which I've had at different points, which is that with everything going on, and especially we even point out the addition of the digital world and the smartphones and all the engineering that goes into making them even more attractive, even just checking WhatsApps and all these things. So all these things together have led me to think at a certain point that we should all be in some sort of therapy at all times. So I'm curious what your responses to that take, or just how you approach this idea of making sure the focus is on our internal selves.
Yes, and I have to say that on the technology side, I used to be very critical of the Haredis' world's approach of trying cutting out all of that stuff, and now I'm not at all. I think they were right on the mark. If there is, or for as long as one can, to keep children off smartphones, even adults, to whatever one can do. But there comes a point where you can't anymore, where you have to engage with the world. I think it's not so much therapy. There's definitely a place for that, and it would be an interesting speciality. It probably exists already from psychiatrists and psychologists and other therapists to be working in. But in a sense, that's what Musar is. Real Musar, good Musar. That's what it is. It's self-therapy. It's reflection. It's working with the Sefer Musar with his Reichshus, being able to access the subconscious. That was Rabbi Yisrael Salanter's important contribution. It wasn't that you should learn Mussar. That's been going on since the time of Shlomo HaMelech, since Moshe Rabbeinu and Sefer Dvorim, I think we spoke about once, is a Mussar Sefer. So there's always been Mussar. His whole thing was how to develop a methodology of accessing the subconscious in the learning of Mussar. And I think if we get better as Rabbonim teaching and Yeshivas teaching and people practicing, a daily practice in Mussar is enormously helpful in calibrating one's mind and one's imagination. And where necessary, yes, couples therapy and individual therapy, just to help bolster that inner place and not get trapped into the guilt. The guilt is such a cop-out. It's such a way of throwing your hands up and just saying, it's presented as, oh, you're terrible, Hashem the Begadna. But what you're really saying is, I'm a bad guy, so what can I do? I'm just a bad guy. And you kind of give up. It's a terrible space to be. What you want to be in is a space of, I'm doing my best. I'm doing amazingly well. Things are very, very hard. But every time I overcome a Yetzer Hara, whether it's to look at something or to do something or to think something or to read something, every time I overcome a Yetzer Hara, or to speak Lashon Hara, or to not to be medaftik in halacha, in Hilchos Shabbos or Tefillah or whatever, every time I overcome that, I'm building a muscle. I'm becoming stronger. I'm becoming more effective. And that's my avodah. That's what I'm here for. So these challenges it's part of it. Would be like somebody going into the gym and saying, I'm happy to go to the gym every day, but take these weights and things away. I want a safe environment where I'm not going to be hurt and I'm not going to stress myself. So what are you doing at the gym? Or like remove gravity and take the Yetzer Hara away. Remove gravity. If you're on the space station, you can lift whatever weights you want to. But you don't develop strength. You develop strength from overcoming gravity. And we're talking about a massive force of spiritual gravity that our generation is being subjected to.
You mentioned that guilt can be a cop-out, which is certainly true, but excessive Hashem always loves me and the situation is just so hard is also a cop-out. So we're on a very narrow bridge between these two. Are you suggesting that we should maybe lean, or if we need to fall, it would be better to fall in that direction? Or does it have to be like right on that razor thin path?
Our door, I think, definitely in that direction. I think already in earlier doors, the whole difference between Gadlus Adam and in Slabotka and some of the Nevaradok approach was this very issue. Do we focus on the guilt or do we focus on the Gadlus Adam? And I think in our generation, more than ever, there's a need to be focusing on the greatness of the human being, our own greatness, with the understanding of what comes with that, what responsibility comes with that. If you get into a jet fighter or a massive airliner and you're the pilot, you need to be thinking of, wow, this is an amazing piece of machinery that I'm driving. And I'm really proud of that. And what confidence has been placed in me and what a responsibility I have and how alert I need to be. I think that appreciating our own Gadlus, and of course the Gadlus HaBoreh and the Gadlus HaTorah, doesn't conflict at all with the sense of responsibility of doing our best to do what's right in all situations, understanding that there will be times we make mistakes and that's how we grow.
Okay, you mentioned the importance of self-awareness and the Mussar focus. So if someone's listening to this right now, and I'm assuming that they have 80 million things on their schedule and they don't really have time or space to start, overhauling their life, what are some practical things they can start doing right now to start growing that awareness and moving themselves in the right direction, specifically in this area?
I would say establish a kvius, if one can do it daily or weekly, establish a kvius in addition to whatever superficial learning one might be doing, a kvius for learning in depth with a chavrusa preferably, taking whatever it is. It can be in Chumash and Meforshim, it can be in Medrash, it can be in Gemara, it can be in Shulchan Aruch, whatever it is, but to be disinterested in quantity and completely dedicated to going deeply into it and discovering things, just discovery and adventure in the Torah, and to do it as a sense of fun, not a sense of obligation. So to introduce more fun into our Limud Torah, to introduce true Yirah into our Shemiras HaMitzvahs, true Yirah in the sense of not of fear, but in the sense of awareness of who I'm standing before and what it is that I'm doing. And to introduce fun into our relationships as well, to make sure that there's playtime. Playing is very important. It's important for creativity. It's important for Avodas Hashem. These difficult chazals where the emotion plays with the Lev Yoson. What does it mean to be Mesachik with the Lev Yoson? What does it mean? We don't know what it means, but there's a value placed on playfulness. And the Gedolei Yisrael that I was close to were all playful. there was a mischievousness, there was a playfulness in their demeanor, in their way, in their interactions. It's terribly important not to lose the playfulness of from life, of life in Yiddishkeit. And I think that if there's a legitimate outlet for playfulness, there's much less need to find the playfulness in areas that aren't permitted.
And to what extent is there an importance to have playfulness in your marriage? And if so, what exactly, could you give us a little bit of what that might look like?
I think it's crucial. It's absolutely important. Again, this is something to be discussed, and different couples will find different ways. Some like actually playing games together, and that's fine. You play a board game, you do something. Some like traveling or going on an adventure or going out for dinner, and they might do it that way, or listening to music together and having fun with each other, kidding each other around and teasing one another a little bit, and just being lighter with one another and being able to make an agreement that that's something we're going to be doing. A lot of it that happens privately when the couple are alone. In their physical relationship, for it to be light and fun and pleasure and exploratory and adventurous, and not to get into boring routine in any area as far as possible. Of course, in the family, there's the stuff that has to be done every day. And that's the problem. There's so much stuff that has to be done every day that one really has to struggle to make the effort, but to understand how important it is to make the effort for lightness and play in my relationship to Hashem, in my relationship to Torah, in my relationship to Ben Adam L'Chavera, and particularly in my relationship with my spouse.
That is beautiful. And we ended up back at the point in one of our previous conversations where you looked at my into my neshama through your Lapin leadership and found that I wasn't being playful enough. So I'm glad we ended up back there, and I will certainly take the advice. Lapin, I appreciate the time. Since we last spoke, we've introduced the lightning round to our episode. So if we just have 2 more minutes, I'll ask 3 short questions. So number 1, we're now in the winter and we have these long Friday nights. So what does Rabbi Lapin like to do with the long Friday night time?
In my case, I am so exhausted by the time Shabbos comes. I'm so sleep deprived that I love to have an early night. That's the truth of it. For me to concentrate after dinner, I love a quiet dinner with my wife, with family, where we're able to have family. Sometimes friends. I'm not big on entertaining on Shabbos for that very reason. I just like to connect with myself and my family and with Shabbos. I don't like to make it a big social thing. Sometimes, of course, we do. But I'd really like it to be us time. For the one, it's literally the only night in the week where I can get a relatively long night during the winter.
Very nice. And for those listening to your Batmonim, there's a tremendous array of sources being incorporated. But if you had to choose one go-to sefer that you look to for some inspiration to get ideas for your Matmonim podcast, which is highly recommended, what would that be?
Because that's so hard, because I've got to answer the Gemara. That's really where most of it comes from, and everything grows out of the Gemara. And at different times, I'm learning different things. The Avodas Hashem is just amazing. If one is willing to go through the Avodas Hashem slowly and carefully and understanding, just an amazing Kedusha. I came across in the Avodas Hashem early this morning on Mitzvah Strichos Kavana. It's just a completely different take on it. So it's full of Kiddush. It's full of new ideas if one wants to explore that. So let's say Avodas Hashem, Shara Bitochen, as we know, is one of the great ways of building bitochen, but the whole sefer is amazing.
Okay. And finally, if you had to choose any job in the world that you had to step into right now in an industry or field that you have not yet been involved in, what would that be?
Wow, what would that be? I think the area of integrating artificial intelligence into the life of the future, I think is just so exciting and mysterious and unknown that I would be, again, the playfulness and the fun. I would find that a lot of fun.
Okay, Rabbi Lapin, thank you so much for joining us today, and we appreciate all of the sensitive and deep insights on this very important topic.
Thank you, Yaakov. Thanks a lot.
Before you go, I just want to let you know that I gathered a bunch of Rav Lapin's fascinating short shiurim on topics related to Kedusha and the Yetzer Hara, and linked to them in the show notes. If you enjoyed this episode, found it fresh, insightful, meaningful, helpful in any way, please take a moment to share it with a few friends. Until next time, keep on steiging, Chevra.